Yes, I'm Abby. Nice to meet everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Um, I am here with my colleague Dave Heacock from Greenbelt and Jonathan Sherwood from the City of Amesbury Open Space Committee. And we're going to talk tonight about a project that we've been working on for the last couple of years on the Greenbelt side to prioritize land for conservation. But specifically what we're focusing on tonight is how we've been working with municipal partners to look at that data and to incorporate that data into open space plans and other planning documents, the why and how, and is it benefiting them, and just kind of what that kind of partnership can look like. So a little bit about Greenbelt. We are a regional land trust. We have been in existence for 60 years. In that time, we've protected over 18,000 acres of land. We own land that is open to the public and managed for recreation or other for natural resources. We hold conservation restrictions and we help others to protect land as well. We work in the region north of Boston, which is 34 cities and towns. So we're starting just north of Boston. We go all the way up to New Hampshire, and we include a significant coastal section, which you can see on this map here. So we do have a lot of communities that are seeing the firsthand impacts of climate change, including coastal flooding, erosion, plus the other impacts that everyone's seeing, like inland flooding and heat, and those types of impacts. So this is some just housekeeping things. Jen went over a lot of the stuff already. One thing I'll mention is that we do have a document up on the conference portal right now that is a PDF of important links and resources. These slides will be up on the portal, and the recording, of course, will be as well. Okay, so very briefly, when we talk about a prioritization, what we're talking about is using GIS data to evaluate natural resource information in the unit of a parcel. And so in this case, we're using data sources that are in most cases publicly available to rank land parcels on different attributes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but what we're not talking about is kind of like, we have a list of the most important parcels, top 100 or something like that. That's not really what we're talking about. We're saying kind of a more objective, like, okay, what are the most important parcels for this feature? Let's say it's drinking water or agriculture. So that's what this kind of analysis is that we're talking about today. And when we're doing that, these are some of the considerations that we evaluated. What are our goals as an organization? What type of priorities do we have, of course? And then what data is available? Sometimes you might have a priority, like we had done a prioritization a number of years ago in 2011. And while we were interested in climate change at that time, the data just wasn't available. And so we really had to wait until this project to do more robust climate analyses. So a lot of those decisions are driven by, of course, what you're interested in, also what data is available, and then the way you combine the data is extremely important. We're going to touch on that very lightly today. Most of what we're focusing on is more kind of the engagement and discussion piece. So we did want to give some background on the project in general, and then the analyses that we did complete. So these are some of the goals of the prioritization project. Of course, at its core, we wanted to identify parcels that are extremely important for protection for a range of resources. We wanted to be able to look at two parcels that seem similar and compare them quickly. So particularly some of these areas that we ended up looking at, like drinking water, for example, there's a lot of different drinking water data sources, or climate resiliency. How do you look at two parcels similar size with good resources and compare them? So that the outcomes or benefits potentially of a prioritization is you can really calculate those and a final score to compare them. Another thing we wanted to do with this project was look at new areas. So in the past, in 2011, when we had completed analyses, we had looked at things like habitat or agriculture, for Greenbelt, very kind of traditional ways of looking at land that's very important to us. We did that again in this project, but the new areas were drinking water and climate resilience specifically. These are new areas of increasing importance for us as a land trust, but also extremely importantly, we do work a lot with municipalities, and we have heard increasingly that those are areas that are really important to them. And so That, that ties into my last bullet of we wanted data that would be relevant to partners. Increasingly over time, the projects that we do are partnership projects. Partnerships are really important to us. And so we knew right off the bat that we wanted to engage and communicate with municipalities and partners. We didn't know what that was going to look like, but we knew we wanted to do it. And then, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of new data available. This project started 2018, 2019, and just that difference of what was available then versus 5 or 10 years ago is just really, really huge. So we wanted to be able to take, advantage of that new data. So the project really was broken into 2 phases, both which lasted about a year. Phase 1 was really kind of discovery and development of the data. We did get funding from 2 different sources to fund this project, which is always really important to talk about how we're able to make it happen. We had a staff committee, and with that staff committee, we developed the methodology for each analysis. We identified kind of the core analyses we wanted to complete, which I'll show you in just a minute. Importantly, because we knew we did want to incorporate municipal kind of perspectives, we looked at the MVP plans, the municipal vulnerability plans for our region. At the time, there were 10 that were completed. There's many more now. But we looked at those plans and looked at the concerns that the communities had identified for themselves in terms of their climate threats, and then kind of summarize them to help kind of in our decision making as to which analyses we wanted to complete. So we incorporated that into that decision making. We then developed methods and had lots of testing and running, different ways of looking at the data to make sure it was accurate. Then what we did is we shared the data, the preliminary data and the methods with an advisory panel. This list on the right-hand side is the folks who were in that advisory panel. And what we really did was we were very lucky to find people who were experts or who were practicing in the field of the area of analysis. And they really did kind of a wonderful deep dive with us and looking at the data we'd used and how we combined it and the results. And then they gave us guidance on what they thought. We then incorporated those data and that, or those changes rather, and that took us into phase 2, which had more funding for it. So that was from a foundation, and also we got a grant from the Massachusetts CZM Coastal Resiliency Program. So in this phase, we shared the kind of second round data with 2 municipalities. This is a picture here of us meeting before COVID with the city of Gloucester. And you can see we're sharing preliminary maps and that kind of thing. We had a couple meetings with them. They gave us feedback. We revised those methods one final time. And then the final phase was doing kind of some outreach and engagement. So we held a webinar that was really geared at municipal staff and volunteers, as well as land trust, local land trust staff and volunteers. And then we run a open space conference within the county every other year. And that same year we were doing it. So we also had a session on that. These are the 6 areas that we focused on for our analysis project. So what we're going to look at today are these ones that are highlighted in red, because those are really the ones that we tied to climate resiliency. So we're going to just go through those now. And this is kind of a cursory explanation. Just talking about these methods and the data that went into them could almost be its own conference session. In the document that I mentioned at the beginning, there's a link to a very long methods document that we put together that really gets into the nitty-gritty of the data and how we combined it and all of that kind of level of detail, if you would like to take a look at that. So the first analysis in the climate set, if you will, is what we called a natural resiliency analysis. And what this is really doing is it's looking at habitat, which we also completed a habitat analysis, but it's looking at habitat with a climate change lens. That's really what it's doing. And so, not only is it places that are providing biodiversity now largely, but it's also looking at what is going to be resilient and provide biodiversity in the future. And so in these slides on the right-hand side, these are examples of the data that we used. In many cases, there was more data that went into them, but a lot of the core data is listed here. And so a major driver of this data set was the Nature Conservancy's resiliency data. This is a really incredible project that they've been working on for over 10 years. It has both terrestrial and coastal data sets, which we used. What it didn't have was freshwater data. So to use, we wanted to make sure to include that. And so we did include a subset of Biomap 2. Biomap 2 does have some sub data layers that are identified as actually being climate resilient for aquatic habitats. So that was our stand-in for freshwater resiliency. We also used protected open space and some other data layers, and we were able to combine that. And this was one of, my experience with this data, using the data before the analysis and after, and then looking at the results, this is one of the places I've really found a benefit of that, being able to compare results against parcels, because the TNC data is wonderful, but it's very complex and it's very detailed. And so sometimes it certainly would take analysis to kind of calculate all the different data sets, because there were many sub data layers that we incorporated. And so this was a really nice way to combine all that and be able to quickly compare data across parcels. Some preliminary results here. Those are some images of the data source, some of the data sources that went into it. And throughout the county, well, I should say for us, almost all of the analyses, we broke our results into 3 categories: critical priority, high priority, and priority. And you can see the number of parcels that ended up in each category increases as the priority level goes down. So, all right, and moving to drinking water. As I mentioned, this has come up a number of times throughout the years as being a really important natural resource for communities. People who work in our, as project managers in our land conservation department have, had many stories about how drinking water resonates with citizens and it resonates with municipalities. And so we knew this was something that was important in and of itself. We have long partnered as an organization with the Ipswich River Watershed Association and other drinking water organizations. And so, we knew this was a focus for us, and we knew it was important for us if we wanted to stay relevant with our communities to continue, increase our focus on this. So drinking water is interesting. It has regulatory data, which is really important to incorporate, data on wellhead protection areas and surface water supply protection areas. So that type of data went into the mix for sure. And that's some of these maps and images that you're seeing. Down below the main results map, you have zone 1 and 2. And then just below the kind of number of parcels, you have the zone A, B, and C. We added, drinking water intakes areas near where there was actual public drinking water. And we did limit this to public drinking water supplies. Other things that we did include were watershed boundaries and other things like that, in order to make sure that we were including land that is important to drinking water, but doesn't necessarily fall under specifically regulated areas. That actually was a change that was driven from our advisory panel. Some of our drinking water experts really recommended that change. Right, moving on to coastal flood mitigation, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Dave Heacock.
Thank you, Abby. I'm Dave Heacock. I'm the Geographic and Technical Support Specialist at Greenbelt, and I've been working on this project also for the last few years. And I will continue out a few of the other analyses we did here. So you're looking at the coastal flood mitigation analysis that we did, and we also did an inland flood mitigation analysis, which we'll look at next. But we kind of started with one flood mitigation model to try to identify parcels, areas of land which were currently under flood risk, but they seemed like they had natural resources and land cover to mitigate excess flood waters. So those might be parcels that we want to protect to prevent any further flood risk from developing into the future. So how this worked basically was looking at a parcel and within it, what are the areas which have high flood risk. So for the coastal flood mitigation model, we use hurricane surge inundation zones and areas that have a greater flooding frequency, for example, would have a higher risk because they're so commonly inundated with storm surge water. But but we also looked at the parcel and evaluated kind of its its qualities that would help it to mitigate floodwaters, such as soil drainage capacity. There are greater and lesser soils for being well draining or not. So we use kind of like the NRCS soils data layer for that to evaluate. And we also incorporated forest cores, which also had a lot more to do with the inland model, but we brought it into our coastal model as well. And with the idea being that kind of large forested areas, we used a minimum size of 100 acres, but large forested blocks are shown to do a lot to soak up extra excess floodwaters and prevent them from going somewhere else, potentially towards infrastructure. So parcels that had a portion of some of those forest cores would also get kind of a bonus if they fell within those risk areas. And then also just like the resilience using some of that TNC data of the wetlands themselves. There are areas for potential marsh migration into the future. There are marshes that have greater resilience, and those would be even more important to protect going into the future. So basically looking at where's the highest risk, and within those risk areas, what have the highest quality at mitigating excess floodwaters. So if we want to look to the next slide, that shows the inland model. And that's taking a similar approach, but with kind of a different set of data inputs. So rather than hurricane surge inundation zones, which is really just a coastal model, it uses the FEMA risk zones. So that covers a broader area. This model would emit the salt marsh layers from kind of the different land cover inputs. And again, does include the forest cores. So that's particularly important for some of these towns which face inland flooding, close to their downtowns or infrastructure, but might have unprotected large forested areas, which if those were developed, we might see even a greater risk for excess floodwater. And so that kind of splitting up and that kind of addition of the forest cores was something that came out of a pilot collaboration with the municipality, and ended up making a lot of sense for us to split it into two different approaches. And finally, we'll look at the urban cooling model, and this deals with the concept of urban heat islands, which are those areas with lots of impervious surface and developed surfaces and concrete and roads, et cetera, that make places particularly hot and much hotter than they would be, if they had a lot of vegetation. So you can see, for example, in the map, those areas in the northwest and southern part of our county, which are more densely developed. And looking at satellite data, you can see how much hotter they are on their land surface because of that development. So what this analysis aimed to do is kind of find the coolest parcels within those really hot areas. So if you look in that the maps on the right there with the different data layers shown around the parcel, it kind of looks in the buffered area around a parcel that is really hot, and then compares that with inside of the area with the parcel which is vegetated, and kind of plays with that ratio to again find like a highly vegetated cool parcel within a hot urban area. And so again, that did use like a lot of satellite imagery and the latest land cover data from MassGIS, but this also being a very kind of human-centric, relating to human health, we incorporated environmental justice populations, which served as kind of a bonus in addition to the risk and the vegetation layers, because those populations approximate to these urban heat island areas have been shown to be particularly vulnerable to the effects of heat stroke and the hazards associated with excess heat. So we thought we'd incorporate that into this model. Okay, so those were kind of the climate related analyses that we did. In terms of getting these implemented in our outreach with towns and cities, these are these are examples of the kind of work that we've done, and we're interested in making them relevant to. So who are we working with? Municipal officials and staff members. We have worked with conservation agents and fire chiefs and town administrators, people who have various interests from cities in the land that they have, and seeing how different planning approaches could be beneficial. Yeah, we've collaborated with open space committees, conservation commissions, and various elected officials. So going into this project, these were all different kinds of people who might have different interests in conservation planning that we wanted to be relevant to and open discussions with. And so we wanted to build relationships. A lot of these people we know, but with turnover, some we don't, and certain cities and towns we haven't collaborated with as much, we might not know as well. So it's a good inroad, to use these analyses and these maps to talk with them. It's also helpful for us to increase our local knowledge, and our project managers know a lot, but we also serve a large area of 34 cities and towns, and so oftentimes people working in at the municipal level know a lot more than we do about particular parcels or areas, and so there's a lot that we can learn from them. Land use planning, like I said, getting these maps in front of them, and potentially getting them implemented into some of their open space plans can be really helpful for us to have an input and be able to express some of our interests and some of our conservation interests within their planning processes. But yeah, having eyes and ears on the ground, there's a lot of just kind of coincidental things that can come up in meeting. There happened to raise a new conservation project just through kind of encountering a meeting and be able to discuss particular parcels, and then as well as funding kind of playing into some of the open space planning or MVP planning. This plugs in really well to that. So that these are all kinds of people in different instances we want to be able to connect with using this analysis. We also wanted to be as helpful to municipalities as we could. We have a strong GIS capacity within Greenbelt that not all municipalities have within our region. Some do have people using GIS technology, and some might have a volunteer, but don't do as much of that. So one thing we've been able to take on and is to kind of use level 3 assessors data, do parcel identification, use some of our in-house knowledge and deed research and stuff like that to help with some of the mapping needs that municipalities currently have. Support their climate mitigation strategies. Again, some might have resources and invest in consultants to get plans for that, but others don't, and some of the work that we've done in the prioritization has been able to support them. Again, they might have certain interests or projects that they're working on the ground, certain priorities that we might be able to plug in on, and being able to connect and hear where they're at on those, hear their ideas, allows us to bring in our resources and experience and ideas to kind of their needs. And then again, funding and grants kind of mutually beneficial there, but yeah, what we do in our mapping and the ways that we can contribute to their projects can go a long way in securing funding for their particular conservation projects. So ultimately, what we've done in the last couple of years, we've been able to collaborate with 9 cities and towns on this prioritization project, and sharing maps and having kind of anywhere from 1 to 4 meetings with a municipality. And I'm sure we'll have several more here in the next couple of years. We've been able to take on various mapping projects for them. Some might have their open space layer handled in in like a spreadsheet, and they don't have it mapped out in terms of a shape file or have a created map of it that's totally up to date. So we've been able to take on some of that and then incorporate that data back into our analysis, as well as Chapter 61 data, certain data like farm ownership, which is kind of another project we've taken on to group parcels together by single ownership as a farm. We've provided that back to them as well. And then again, open space plans, master plans, MVP plans, and projects grants. Those are all things we've been able to contribute our maps to and collaborate on. I think with that, we were going to open it up for questions in case there are any here in the middle. Jen, are there any?
So there's no questions in the chat just yet.
All right. I think we can continue on unless anyone has one.
Did we want to maybe do the poll at this point? Did we forget that at the beginning?
Sure, that's great. Yep, I'll go ahead and put up the poll. Let's see. So this is just something that you all can fill out. Can everybody see that now? Yeah, okay, good. So this is something we wanted to just run to check in and see what people's experiences were with working with municipalities, and something that we could kind of potentially follow up on at the end as part of a discussion to talk about different experiences and people's comfort level experience with working with, it could be municipalities, or if people here are from municipalities and working with land trusts, whatever the situation is. All right, and I think Jonathan, you're up, so I'll put myself back on mute.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. Jonathan Sherwood from Amesbury, the town that's actually a city, small town, but we have city status here in Massachusetts. And I am the chair of the city's Open Space, Natural Resources and Trails Committee. I've been on that committee since its inception, and it started when I was on the city council here in Amesbury. But now I'm just serving as the chair of the Open Space Committee, and will disclose at the beginning, I'm also currently on the board of Essex County Greenbelt. So I'm happy to have this opportunity to collaborate on this presentation. Just real quickly, some context. So what I'll be talking about is our experience with working with Greenbelt on our open space and recreation plan that we did in 2020, and their engagement and involvement with that. A little bit of context. Amesbury's kind of a classic small New England mill town. As you can see from the image there, we've got a river that flows through town into the Merrimack, drops enough in elevation through the center of town, or the center of town was built around the drop in elevation, so that it fueled a small but robust mill manufacturing in the 1800s and early 1900s. And we have lots of waterways, so we're really a town of hills, farms in between, and then rivers and lakes and waterways running in between. So it's has a lot of natural features. We have several large, well-loved parcels in town that the town has purchased over the years. A town forest was purchased, I think, in the 1930s. A few parcels that have been augmented since then with some adjacent parcels. Woodson Farm and Battis Farm kind of speak for themselves, two large farms in town that the city bought as well back when we were a town. And then, of course, we have lots of other larger and smaller parcels that have one form or another of protection on them. We came into this, our 2020 open space and recreation plan without a lot of history of land management and resource planning. So our primary approach had been in purchasing the two big farms in the 90s, fairly close to each other, some with town funding, bond funding, and some with state funding, had been to buy them and then just let them be. They had been about as much as had been done on them as both of them. There are still farmers who do haying to keep them open, but that was about the extent of it. There are other uses that are happening there, but it's pretty ad hoc and nobody really knows who's in charge of what and with decision making. So that's kind of where we're coming into it. And before 2020, the incorrect date there, we didn't really have an approved open space recreation plan. We had a 7-year OSR plan that had never been finalized with the state because it never could kind of meet the threshold. So we had something previously, but it really wasn't adequate. So in the 2016, kind of in that gap of planning, we set up this open space committee, and it's really an advisory committee, but that is not purely advisory. We have folks, representatives from the Concom, City Council, and Planning Board, as well as members of the public, so that it actually can be the kind of active advisory committee, and that it actively represents the interests of those other boards in regards to these open space questions. Next slide, please. So what really kicked us off, we had formed the committee in 2016. One of our first goals was to develop a new open space and recreation plan. We were trying to do that purely with our volunteer board for a while, and it was going to probably turn out that it would take us 7 years to develop the 7 years plan, at least. In 2019, as we were trying to sort that out, the Municipal Vulnerability Grant Program opened up with the Commonwealth, and we applied and received an early MVP grant from the Commonwealth that led us to do the initial assessment. You see the cover of the report there. And it was really a new, for these sets of issues, land use and land management, it was a whole new level that we had never had before, kind of applied to it. So even though it was very specific to the MVP framework that the Commonwealth has, it gave us it really gave us a big kickstart with gathering a lot of data and information about our natural resources and our open spaces, because of, as I said, so much of our town is either a hill that drains into a waterway, or it's a waterway. So we the thinking about water is an important part, and that really comes into the climate change questions. Next slide, please. Out of that report, one of the key priorities that was identified in the report as something we needed that would be important is to have an updated open space and recreation plan. So I think that was crucial that was in there. We had out of that MVP process, as I said, a lot of information was gathered that is kind of congruent with what my colleagues have just been talking about with the Greenbelt's work, and I've listed out some of the maps that were developed for the MVP report. That one there is the resilience and connected landscapes, which actually is we'll see again in a moment. So next slide, please. So from that, we had that initial grant, and we turned the city turned right around the next year, or in that year, in 2019, and applied for a second round MVP grant. And the grant, and this was, we applied for this kind of in consultation with the Commonwealth, with the MVP staff and program, was to use an MVP grant to create an open space and recreation plan, and to have an open space and recreation plan that integrated kind of in a robust manner that climate change perspective. So we got that grant. The city, there was a contract manager at the city who worked in our environmental services at the city, but he really designated the open space committee to work heavily with the consultant that was hired. So we're able to hire a consultancy firm from here in Massachusetts, BSC. I think they're out of the Worcester area, to help us with this plan. They had worked on the MVP reports as well, so we were able to immediately leverage their information. So that really took us from our 5 miles an hour pace to 60 miles an hour pretty quickly when we got that grant, and we're able to hire a consultant and finally able to tackle this task of having an open space plan. Then of course, COVID-19 hit in early 2020 and threw it off, but we quickly pivoted, did a lot of virtual public sessions and online surveying, since we kind of lost the ability to meet directly during the period of this project. And as I'd already said, we leveraged a lot of the prior work from the MVP award. And that picture there is just of one of our big open farms. You can kind of get a sense of the scale there. It straddles a road. You can see it in the distance as well as in the foreground. Next slide. So how Greenbelt got involved, they were in the middle of their outreach to Merrimack Valley communities and across the county as well. But in particular, I don't think Abby or David mentioned this, that as part of that outreach, they had also prioritized to kind of make sure that they were including the Merrimack Valley, which was at the further end of their historical reach for Greenbelt. It had not been as active up here. Greenbelt does have a couple properties in Amesbury and a conservation restriction, but had not been very active with the town itself. So part of that outreach, it kind of came along at the right time. They were offering to support Amesbury, and from our end, we were hungry, given that we had very little background apart from the MVP work, which had very specific focus and only looked at certain resources and certain parts of our infrastructure. It helped with our open space recreation plan, but it wasn't a substitute. The perspective of Greenbelt really helped us quickly kind of gain some of that broader perspective through the activities of talking about their maps. In our case, we also were lucky that one of the someone at Greenbelt is a member of the Open Space, Natural Resources and Trails Committee, and is an active member. And so she was able to help broker the connection. And as I said, I was in the process in 2020 of joining the board. So what Greenbelt contributed was a set of prioritization maps that they developed after, as part of their portfolio that they were just showing, but also kind of developed in consultation with what we needed. So we had very specific things. This was an open space and recreation plan. So we had the focus not just on natural resource issues, but also on use issues. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So we were able to work with Greenbelt about what our needs were for information. One of the things that the Greenbelt maps add, even on top of some of the maps that we already had from the consultancy, from the MVP, previous MVP grant, and what they also contributed to the report, was this the work that goes into the prioritization. So it wasn't just raw data. It didn't just say here lies water or here lies habitat, but it took that information. One of the things that I've liked about those Greenbelt maps, it takes that information and really digests it and puts it into actionable prioritization. So it can be hard to look at a layered map that is just the data, especially without a trained eye and know what to make of it. The Greenbelt maps kind of do that work of prioritization. That was a huge help. And being able to then take that kind of information and be able to kind of see it, understand it, do something with it, especially with the parcel level focus. All right, next slide, please. So this is just an example. Immediately coming out of there, one of our highest priorities, we had a lot of the open space that we had under ownership of either the city or well, under the city, because the Concom properties did have levels of protection, but the city owned a lot, in particular this Woodson Farm property, and the large number of parcels and acres that were part of that had zero protection put on them. We also had our town forest parcels, which are immediately adjacent to Woodson Farm, has zero protection on them as well. And as you can see from the map on the left, they are, I think this was a resiliency map. Dave and Abby, I think this was a pullout from the resiliency map. So it's mapping landscape resilience. And you can see that they're high priority. You can also see from that map on the left, we had taken GPX data that we had developed just on a volunteer basis and layered it in to the Greenbelts map so that we could see kind of the overlapping values in the maps that they provided. And as you can see in the purple, and then in the bottom left, there's lots of trails. That's the town forest in the bottom left. And then the purple is the Woodson Farm. A lot of that's the Woodson Farm parcels. So these maps really helped us kind of visualize it and see the importance of it beyond just the fact that those were beloved properties. On the right, what you have is that's a cutout from the a different, this was from the consultant, the BSC, the resilience and connectedness map. And you can see that there's a lot of interconnectedness there as well, and kind of outlined in red is parcels that were permanently protected subsequent to the open space and recreation plan. So having these maps really helped us focus it at the local level and to be able to identify these parcels, organize them into orders, get them passed approved by the city council and signed by the mayor. Next slide, please. And this, I think I already kind of covered this. You can see on the left there, that's the same image pulled out a little bit, all the different trails, and the maps, and that addition of the GPX data came out of talking with Greenbelt about what we needed. And so they incorporated data over a couple iterative steps into their maps that made it back into our plan, and you can see it in the larger context as well. So it helped give us that we were not just looking at the Greenbelt's mapping interest, say in natural resilience in this case, but putting that in the user context with those maps. So it was a great collaboration on that information. Okay, next slide.
I think I will hop in here.
Back over. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So moving on to how you might think about getting this done for your own organization, some of the things that we went through and had to think through. First off, finding the approach that's right for you. We had already done a GIS analysis, and when we were coming up to talking about this project, we had 2 full-time GIS staff, and so we really took the GIS heavy approach and made use of all the GIS data from the state and conservation data and climate resilience data that we could. But it might not be the best approach that you want to take based on the personnel and the resources that you have. It doesn't have to be parcel based. It could be more regional, or it could be just working with existing parcel maps and highlighting priority areas. It doesn't have to be a full-fledged GIS analysis, or maybe you just focus on 1 or 2 particular analyses and not such a broad range. But going through that,
can I jump in there?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, yeah, even if you didn't have the explicit mapping available and just had the mapping that's available through the Commonwealth and other venues to offer, one of the things I would highlight, our committee and the folks on the city council, the folks on the planning board for the most part, and the folks on the Concom, they're lay people who will look at those maps and have a hard time understanding them. So I think part of what we got that was valuable from Greenbelt was not just the maps, but the interpretation, like how to read them. What's the story behind that data? Because that can be, as someone who loves maps, I still look at a lot of those and can struggle to read them. And so what you can land trust can bring is the interpretation and the understanding of what the data means. So, right.
That's a good point. Yeah, thanks. Because like the Nature Conservancy data, for instance, there's a huge document going on behind that, which takes some conservation background to understand. We put a lot of work into kind of understanding what that data meant, and then put in the work to incorporate it to our analysis, and then convey it to municipalities. So yeah, that's an important role you can play in terms of bridging the academic and land conservation worlds. So yeah, make the time to do it. Do your research into data sets like that, or different have meetings among your staff. We had over a dozen meetings internally of kind of abstracting our strategic goals to how we wanted that to play out in our prioritization. Collaborate with the academic world and other nonprofits, the people who made this data, such as the Nature Conservancy, and we worked with watershed organizations, et cetera, people who know those specialties for the kinds of analysis you might want to do, and chat with them and get feedback. If you don't have all the capacity in-house, either through experience or just time, you can hire an intern. This is a good graduate level GIS project. If you have a university in your area, or even remotely, there might be possibility there to collaborate. And if you can kind of express to them, what your priorities are and what data you might want to use, that could be an effective way to get a big project like this done. And then funding can help with that as well. As Jonathan and Abby have spoken to, there's various ways to fund these sorts of prioritization projects. And as a good starting point, we have really good mapping tools in-house. First, highlighting Mass Audubon's Mapper, which they did an earlier session in this conference about. So if you didn't catch that, make sure to watch the rewind of it. But they built their own prioritization tool, which is web-based, and there's a whole bunch of different conservation data sets that allows you to plug in the parameters that you want to rank those and weight those in different ways. And it's also parcel based. So a really good tool, if you want to use their existing data sets and have an idea of how you want those weighted and what kind of outcomes you might want, that's a good place to start and create maps and use that as a talking point with the municipalities. And like Jonathan said, have a good understanding of the underlying data sets and be able to communicate what those results really mean. And then more broadly, MassGIS's Mass Mapper is not a prioritization tool, but it's a web-based viewer for all the different data sets that are available, just from parcel data to biomap 2 to areas of critical environmental concern and a whole bunch of different natural resources. So just for basic mapping and exploration, those are good places to start.
Okay, I think this is back now for me. So, kind of moving to wrapping up, one of the really important parts of this project is about prioritizations in general and working with municipalities on open space planning is the efficacy of helping to direct funding towards critical parcels. Because, land is expensive in Massachusetts, and it's especially expensive in the region that we're in. And so, this has been one of the critical drivers for Greenbelt, but also for the municipalities we work with. So, open space plans open up, of course, funding from the state once a community has that plan protected. Well, MVP plans work the same way, right? Municipal vulnerability plans. And so Amesbury has been really creative at using those MVP funds to actually allow them to create their open space plan. But there's also, those are key sources of funding potentially for projects as well. So this project here, this is in Linfield. This is a 21-acre project that was it was a right of first refusal, Chapter 61, priced at $2.7 million under threat of development. And we worked with the town to help support them to apply for an MVP grant to acquire this land. And it was awarded a $1.6 million MVP grant to protect this property. They did use, so down at the top there is an aerial photo of the land. There's some really important things about this property. It's very special. It is protecting the headwaters of the Ipswich River, which is identified as a critical climate corridor by the Nature Conservancy. It's, of course, a huge drinking water resource in our region, and it already can struggle with low flows and other challenges, and at the same time is supporting thousands of people's drinking water source. So in our prioritization analysis, we had identified this property. The map on the left shows it as a critical priority for drinking water. And then it was also identified as a priority for natural resiliency as well as inland flood mitigation. The town used those maps in the MVP application and had identified it as a priority in their MVP plan. And so it was a nice way to tie the parcel to the importance of climate resiliency and tie that to the plan. It's unclear how funding is going to go with that program in the future with land conservation. It has been used for land conservation before this, but it's not a common use. It's also being used for, fixing bridges and things like that. So we have had, this is a recent success. This is a project that's going to close this year. But climate resiliency is increasingly important in funding, even with our traditional land protection programs, funding programs. More and more frequently, you're getting more questions about climate data. And so this is important for those grant programs. It's also increasingly important to communities. We've had other projects where we had tried to get projects funded a number of years ago, hadn't always had success with certain municipalities. They then went and did climate planning on their own, identified priorities. In one case in particular, a parcel in West Newbury that we protected, it actually provides drinking water for West Newbury and Newburyport. Newburyport had done some climate planning in the interim time, identified drinking water as an important priority. And then while they hadn't been interested in funding a project a number of years before, with that climate planning completed, they then were interested in funding that project, which was completed. So, this is a really important way to attract that funding and also to engage with important partners such as municipalities. All right, and So something to keep in mind is that, our experience has been that this process really has varied. And I think this would be true of any outreach that, you would want to conduct. We, as kind of explained here in the recreation example, we've really tried to customize this process to each municipality. Some of them are very simple. We make the maps, we meet with them, they say, great, thank you, and that's pretty much it. Some of them really get into the data and do a really deep dive, whether it's in recreation. We've had other communities really get into the agricultural data that we created. We've had others do the open space mapping that Dave mentioned, Chapter 61 mapping. So it really depends on the community. That's both in the way, like the number of meetings, the type of customization we've done, the amount of time that we spend. All of those things have just varied, and we've tried to be really flexible around that. Another thing is that, we have noticed that not only has the process changed, but what each community is interested in is really sometimes different. But what we do find uniformly is, well, each community kind of has its own perspective, and some, the deep dive that they might want to do is different. The change that we made to include these more human-centric concerns, such as drinking water and flooding and urban heat, really seems to be something that people relate with and connect with, particularly in communities that maybe don't have as much of a history of open space planning. As Jonathan mentioned, Greenbelt, part of Greenbelt's strategic plans, previous and current, is to expand our work in regions that have been underserved by Greenbelt historically. For us, it's one of the key areas is the Merrimack River Valley, which is in the northern part of our county. And so many of those communities don't have as much, history of doing open space. And so for them, certainly we've noticed that this data has been relevant, but actually it's true in the communities that we've worked with who have, significant resources and years and years and years of open space planning. So pretty much across the board, we have found that to actually be consistent. The urban cooling, if it's relevant, the flooding, the drinking water really seems to galvanize people and to engage them. This image here on the right is just the urban cooling map for the city of Methuen, who we worked with. And it's just an example of, a different way for us as a land trust to look at land, but in a way that this community found really, really interesting. Okay, and just wrapping up, we have some, lessons learned and some summaries of this project and this work that we've done. We've broken them into kind of ideas and things that we've learned about, just relating maybe perhaps more specifically with the prioritization, and then some that are more general. So we've really found with the prioritization overall, it helps to kind of succinctly tie dollars and resources and time. So, helping you be more impactful in your work and tie organizational strategies to projects, tying, keeping the resources that are so critical for all of us. We all are limited in the amount of time and money we have, and direct them towards those really important parcels. With that said, we know that for prioritizations, they're important and they're helpful, but they're just one tool. And so it's really important to have the support of the community, the funding, and of course, a willing and ready landowner. So it's really important to remember that. It's not listed here, but one thing I like to say is that, prioritizations and data are limited in terms of, you always have to do on the ground checking. So that's another thing to check with both the local people as well as what literally is on the ground. One of the real kind of discussion points for us as a land trust at the beginning was, did we really want to share this data? This is not something we had done in the past. And at least so far, the risk has been worth it. We have found that, we've really been able to build partnerships with the municipalities that we've worked with. It has created opportunities for, increased building on existing relationships, as well as kind of building up new ones with new communities like Methuen, who we didn't have as much history working with. And now we have assisted them with some project grants of their own, and we know them by name and that kind of thing. So it's really, and it's also kind of helped us build up some of the funding, as we mentioned before. And then, final part of the prioritization lessons learned is that it did pay off for us to incorporate municipalities throughout the process. First, from just looking at the MVP plans, piloting it with the municipalities, improved our process for us, and then also kind of incorporating their feedback as we can go. And then more generally, for some of the lessons learned on general just outreach, and these do apply to the prioritization work, but are a little more general. This process really benefits both parties. So, from what we've heard from Jonathan and others, the prioritization maps have informed and assisted the municipal efforts in open space planning, but it's also helped Greenbelt. Of course, we always go back to funding, but helping us learn more about the towns that we serve and work in, learning, new people and new resources, hearing about their priorities helps us adjust. So it's been really beneficial. It also has improved our data, which has been really beneficial. We've mapped hundreds of acres of open space, protected open space that we did not know was permanently protected. That has been huge for us. It's been so helpful and interesting. We've improved our agricultural data in communities. So it's been really great from that perspective. And then it's, some of these benefits that we've been talking about through this presentation, we did not necessarily anticipate at the beginning. So getting that increased kind of communication and eyes and ears on the ground, that's been a really great unanticipated benefit. And I already mentioned this, but the knowledge sharing is two ways. So, that is certainly true with the prioritization, but we've been learning from the municipalities, and then, we've been able to help share some of our knowledge, and, because we work with this data, Dave and I, every day. It's our meat and potatoes of our work. And so we've been able to share that with them. And then I know we've said this a lot, but just we really are finding in our work that climate concerns and climate information is really increasingly driving funding and interest as well. So I think that's everything. And we would like to open it up to questions, and you're welcome to throw them in the chat. If you'd rather raise your hand and unmute, we're certainly open to that. It's kind of nice to pretend a little bit like we're more in person. So, and I'm going to stop sharing just so we can see folks. And you can also look at the poll too. Now we have some poll results to take a look at. And if we don't, we do have Kate Powditch is raising her hand. So I'm going to ask Kate to unmute. Go ahead, Kate.
Thanks, Abby. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm only laughing because Kate is Greenbelt's president. So
yeah, I was going to introduce myself. I thought I should disclose that in case people didn't know. And maybe this is a little bit unfair because I know more obviously about this than most of the listeners, but could you talk a little bit about some of the lessons you learned from the early municipal interactions and work that you did, and how that is shaping and changing perhaps some of the way that you're doing that moving forward?
Sure, yeah. So we worked in detail with the town of Essex and the city of Gloucester. And those communities are both coastal communities who have seen significant impacts from coastal flooding. And so, and also Gloucester they were interesting kind of to work with as two communities because they're nearby, but Essex is relatively small and Gloucester is relatively large. Gloucester has a very large staff with high levels of expertise and capacity. They have engineers, they have GIS folks. So it's really interesting. That feedback we got from them really drove us, as Dave mentioned, to separate to the flooding analyses into the inland and coastal flooding, which was a huge improvement in our analysis. It also had us create the forest core data that we did create. And so I think that helped certainly improve the data, but it also just some of that initial feedback, I think, kind of rings in our ears sometimes when we're meeting with municipalities or preparing them. It helped kind of get us ready maybe to help anticipate the way that communities look at this land and the type of questions and concerns that they might have. Dave, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's a good overview. And I'm reminded too of working with Essex. We ran into, again, the low quality of some of the assessors data in that area. By and large, the assessors data is really great, which, bolstered us to do this project. But they had a particular area where it was like, the parcels were not accurate to size. Some were large, some were small. And so it was underrepresented in the prioritization. And so we had to be adaptive and then draw it more as an area. And work through some discussions with them to properly portray on the maps, the value of those areas. So yeah, there's a lot with that we learned through working through the limitations of, the analysis approach that we took in terms of flooding and changing it. And then also just in terms of the underlying data and yeah, working to get the best final result that we could and being adaptive.
Yeah, it's a great point, Dave. We ended up that was an important lesson to learn, was that, the data is limited and the parcel data is limited. And so that approach that Dave mentioned, we've actually applied to other communities we've worked with when a certain region is underrepresented because of parcel size or some other concern, to be able to kind of identify that as a zone that's important, even though it may not pop up in our prioritization. So any other questions? If not, I kind of want to open it up, because I see there's a number of people who have pretty significant outreach experience themselves. And so I'd love to anybody to share experience or a lesson learned that they've had, if there aren't any other questions. Oh, we got a quiet group tonight. All right. Well, if nobody wants to share or ask any questions, oh, I see somebody's turning on their video.
Do people need to be unmuted on our end?
Yeah, they just have to raise their hand. Oh, I see. Stephen raised his hand.
I might as well say something.
Go ahead, Stephen.
It's back muted again.
I just asked you to unmute, Stephen. Let's see if that works.
Okay. So I'm from Westwood, and I was chair of the Open Space and Recreation Plan Committee, as well as being on the planning board. I think the big thing that came out of, and actually our open space plan didn't go into data the way you people did. That's quite extensive. We just certainly didn't have the funding and all to do that kind of stuff. But the thing we brought out was the lack of management plans for our conservation land. It was just there, and the Conservation Commission hadn't done much about it or anything about it, and even our DPW didn't know, do I cut this field? Don't cut this field? Things like that. And what kind of forestry management, if any, would be done. So still trying to get interest up in the town to do that, to fund that. The Conservation Commission keeps bringing it up and talking about it, but so far haven't had any success in making that happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. We have actually run into that comment and kind of that input from a number of municipalities that we've worked with. And so the analysis we did only evaluated the unprotected portion of parcels. So if it's Conservation Commission land, it may not have, ended up in our analysis. But for some municipalities where the land wasn't protected, they have actually used this kind of prioritization. And certainly you could look at Mapper or something else to help look at the lands that you do have protected. And then, they did use our priority data to kind of evaluate different ways or approaches to do management. And some, what resources are there and what's important. So that might be something that you want to look at. And Jonathan in the chat says, sounds familiar to see you. So
something else you might be interested in is Westwood has, well, if you look at the statistics on protected land, Westwood rates very poorly because we have a huge chunk of land from what was known as Hale Reservation, now calling it Hale Education, where they do all sorts of nice programming and summer camps and I think and year-round camps actually to teach students about nature and get them out in the woods and into nature. So it's unprotected. So for a long time, we've been another one of the things that the Open Space and Recreation Plan said was to put a conservation restriction on that. Naturally, they need money to do that. That money would go to maintaining their program. There'd be an endowment to maintain the many programs that they have. So they're trying to get well, 3 sources: the town of Dover, the town of Westwood, and just fundraising from the general public to get about what 34 million or so to do that. So each town, they want Westwood and Dover each put in 10 million, and it's going well through Dover. The big problem there is, talk about education, is no one seems to, no one really knows what a conservation restriction is and why it's needed. And if we got hair reservation, we've had it all this time. What are we worried about? But they will have to sell off little pieces of their property to get them the money, the shortfall that they have in their budget, unless they do this. And it's not insignificant amount of land that would be sold to, for as some kind of development of single, big mansions and whatnot. So that's a real possibility if this doesn't happen. So should we have to educate everyone about what it is? I just spoke to the Conservation Commission, and they had no idea what the conservation restriction on hair was all about. So it's a big job ahead.
Yeah, that certainly can be challenging. I don't know if, Jonathan, if it sounds like when Amesbury had been protecting land, it was mostly through acquisition. Have you had an experience where you've been placing a conservation restriction on existing municipal land and having to kind of
No, that hasn't been an
This
approach.
is privately owned land. This is
it is.
privately owned. That's the problem, is people don't realize it's privately owned. The town has actually has a real gift there, because at no cost to the town, they've been getting this huge forest area and recreational programs going on for all these years for free. And so the first reaction is, well, we've had it for free for so long, why all of a sudden would we have to pay for it?
Yeah. Sounds familiar.
Yeah. But that's what's happening here, and it's some big challenges in making some of these things happen. It's and I just a lot of work for people that are involved in this.
Yeah, it is really a lot of work, and we've never, if we hadn't used some of the things that we listed in the getting it done slide, we certainly couldn't have completed these projects. Like the picture there was one of our early interns. We've had an intern project with Salem State University where we've had GIS interns coming in, and we could not have gotten done this and many other projects if we didn't have that, along with funding and all the other things we talked about. So it can be challenging to get it done, and that's the only way we've been able to do it, this type of work, the planning work.